But what I do know is we're about to talk to Lance Foreman, and a story on the front page of the Telegraph today says a cameraman on the BBC's controversial Gaza documentary appeared to celebrate the October the 7th massacre. This is a guy called Hatem Rawagh, who was listed as an additional cameraman on the film, posted 2 tweets apparently praising the worst terror attack in Israel's history. He appeared to applaud the killing of an Israeli soldier, sharing a video of a gunman that he said should be watched 1 million times. Quite sickening, quite ghastly, quite appalling. Meanwhile, it turns out that the BBC paid 400,000 quid to have this controversial Gaza documentary, which used the voice and the narration of a boy who's the son of a Hamas operative. Incredible stuff. Let's talk to Lance Foreman, a man who has been talking about why the BBC needs to be sanctioned for quite some time. Lance, very good morning to you. Welcome.
Yeah, good morning to you, Mike.
I mean, it's hard to believe that you and I are even having this conversation in this day and age, but you and I have had many of these conversations in the past. This perhaps is the most egregious crime I think the BBC has committed against Israel in a history of many crimes against them.
Well, I wouldn't say it's the most egregious. I mean, they've been pretty egregious for the last 20 to 30 years, but this is the most obvious. They've become so brazen now that, you know, that they're not even watching their backs anymore. So this one just sort of slipped out there, and it was very easy to pick up where they'd been going wrong. You know, obviously paying £400,000 to essentially to provide Hamas propaganda, possibly some of that money fed through to Hamas. It's not only egregious, it's actually criminal. And I've sort of come to the conclusion now that, you know, it's enough of investigations. We actually need to start criminal prosecutions against perhaps board members of the BBC. You know, this has been going on for 20 to 30 years now. And they, you know, there have been inquiries. You know, Kemi Badenoch asked for an inquiry. There was an inquiry 20 years ago called the Balin Report, but it's never been made public. In fact, the BBC spent £500,000 of licence fee payers' money to make sure that the thing never saw the light of day. There was a report only last year by a lawyer called Trevor Asserson, which proved statistically that the BBC are, you know, biased against Israel, just like the Balin Report. You know, it's obvious now, and you know, it's too late for inquiries. We now need criminal prosecutions. You know, trying to justify what Hamas do. They're a proscribed terrorist organization. Trying to justify it, which is exactly what the BBC do, is a criminal offence under the Terrorism Act 2000.
And paying criminals and paying terrorists presumably is also a criminal offence, because Danny Cohen, the former head of BBC Television, has also said this week it's a week of shame for the BBC. There are questions they must answer as to whether or not this documentary was misleadingly edited. Further concerns about statements released by the corporation initially when they were asked about it, when they said that they had full editorial control of the programme. And then, you know, they never... I mean, I don't know much about how BBC documentaries get through a process, but I'm pretty sure they'll go through several processes before they reach the air. So people must have known that this boy that was used, Abdullah, was the son of a Hamas operative, surely.
Well, that's true, but I think the payment actually is a bit of a red herring, because, you know, yes, the BBC paid £400,000 towards, you know, Hamas or, you know, their chums. But quite frankly, the British government pays £129 million to UNRWA. You know, the UNRWA schools, you know, there were UNRWA members that were involved in the hostage taking, involved in the murders, involved of keeping hostages over the last 18 months. And yet the British government is paying UNRWA. UNRWA is, you know, they set up schools where these Gazan children are taught to hate Jewish people. You saw those kids on the stage, you know, on that stage where a baby, a 9-month-old baby and a 4-year-old toddler were brutally murdered. They were there in coffins, and yet the Gazan children dancing around. Well, they've all been taught at UNRWA schools, and we're funding them.
It is extraordinary.
So, you know, maybe the British government should be taken to task for funding terrorism. You know, the British taxpayers are funding this stuff, Mike. It's crazy.
It really is incredible. There's going to be some kind of demonstration, I think, today or tomorrow outside of BBC headquarters. But
It is
I mean,
7 p.m. today. Yeah.
if indeed it turns out that money did change hands and money can be proven to have been passed to Hamas, surely Tim Davies' position is untenable, isn't it, as the Director General?
I think we've gone further than heads will roll. I actually genuinely think there need to be, criminal investigations into whether we have been justifying Hamas and therefore justifying a prescribed terrorist organization. I think the police need to be brought in at this stage. You have to ask the question, that the BBC have essentially been a mouthpiece for Hamas over 20 years. And you have to think, why has that happened? Why do Hamas do this? Hamas don't have a strong army. If the Israelis wanted to wipe out Hamas, they could do it very easily. What Hamas do, though, is they use children as human shields. We've heard it many times before. So they know the Israelis don't want to kill children. They know that. But sometimes children get, killed because they're put out in front there, as I say, as human shields.
Yeah.
But why do Hamas do this? Because it's not going to help them win the war. Why do they do it? They do it because they know that the BBC will publicize it to gain sympathy for them. It's almost as though the BBC is the bullet in their weapon.
Yeah.
Because if the BBC didn't publicize the fact that these children, it's terrible that these children are being killed. But if the BBC didn't publicize it, Hamas wouldn't do it because there'll be no advantage to them in doing it. So Hamas are complicit. The BBC are sort of complicit. They're partners. And the reason why the BBC are so awful is because they are seen globally as the standard bearers of journalism. And if they do it, everybody else does it. And the result of this, Mike, is that we now have, not just in Britain, but across the world, anti-Semitism at its worst ever level since the 1930s. And this is all down to the BBC's delegitimization and demonization of Israel. It's absolutely shocking, and I think we really need to sort of look very hard into this and potentially criminal prosecutions.
Yeah, and there are continued equivalents that they keep doing on their TV news shows, thanks to people like Jeremy Bowen, who used to be quite sensible but has now gone completely gaga on Gaza, if you'll pardon that sort of alliteration. They can't be trusted anymore to be completely neutral, because they seem to think that letting out prisoners from Israeli jails who have been put there because of the committing of crimes that they've done, in many ways, in many cases, terrorist crimes, which have caused the deaths of thousands and thousands of people. They think that's equivalent to letting out children and dead children and mothers and old people who have been taken hostage and kept underground for more than 500 days. I mean, it seems extraordinary to me that even in any world of journalism that you would make that connection.
Well, yes, and there's another issue in terms of equivalence, because when the BBC come under attack about their bias, their standard response is, well, we get just as many complaints against, saying that we're biased against Israel as we do that we're in favor of Israel. Now, the fact of the matter is, there are somewhere between perhaps 4 to 5 million Muslims in the UK.
Yeah.
A poll was done a year ago which showed that 3/4 of Muslims in the UK don't think that Israel should exist. Now, there are only about 200 to 250,000 Jews. So, there's 15 times as many Muslims as there are Jews. So just saying you get equal numbers of complaints on both sides isn't good enough. You need 15 times more complaints on the other side for it to be balanced.
Yeah.
So the BBC, the BBC have been playing this game for a long, long time. Hopefully this film is the catalyst that draws a line under it. I'm not sure that it will be, but I think we need to go in really hard now. I was very, very pleased with Kemi Badenoch's statement that that unless something is done about this, that at least the Conservative Party, they're not in government, but they're not going to support the licence fee anymore. It's enough with the BBC now. Something has got to change.
Do you think Tim Davies should resign over this?
Well, it's not just Tim Davies. This is Perhaps yes, but this is an institutional problem within the BBC. It's not just Tim Davie. There are other members of the board. I did a very quick investigation myself a few days ago, looking up, all the different board members of the BBC, and there are some questions to be asked with some of them. But it's not just the BBC. I know Jewish people that work in the BBC, and they are afraid to speak out. They're afraid because they know that there's an institutional bias and an institutional problem there. There was a march. Do you remember about a year ago? There was a march against campaigning, against anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
And the BBC refused to allow any of their staff to attend that rally.
Yes, I do remember that. Yeah, amazing.
Do you remember that? It was ridiculous, Mike. Yeah. Absolutely ridiculous.
Absolutely.
But the BBC, the BBC have been involved in so many cover-ups over the years. Whether it was Jimmy Savile or Hugh Edwards recently, Martin Bashir. The anti-Israel bias is just another. It's another thing that they buried, they covered up. I really would like the Balin report to come out, because it was produced 20 years ago. So yeah, it's perhaps out of date now, but it would have made recommendations. And I would like to see whether the BBC followed those recommendations, because I very much doubt they did.
Yeah, absolutely right. I think time has come for a proper and serious, investigation into what it is that they have been doing for all this time. You're absolutely right. Good to talk to you. Lance Foreman there, thank you very much indeed. Former MEP, of course, former Brexit Party MEP as well.